Marx didn't see the role of communists as being there to produce a sort of pre-prepared plan for what the future would look like that everybody else would then follow in the aftermath of a revolution. He believed that was something that was worked out collectively in struggle. So the Civil War in France is actually Marx's most extensive writing on what society could look like after a working class revolution. And that's because he was observing it in practice, and he was observing it in the Paris Commune, which I'm going to talk a bit about. Just first of all, on the pamphlet was written just days after the Paris Commune was very, very brutally crushed. So this working class revolution in which the revolutionaries were slaughtered on an absolutely horrendous scale. And the pamphlet made Marx quite famous, or probably notorious is a better word to use. At the time he wrote it, he'd been living in exile for decades here in London. He'd had to flee continental Europe in the aftermath of the kind of previous waves of revolutionary upsurges in 1848. And for much of his life he then lived in poverty and obscurity in London. When he wrote this pamphlet, The Civil War in France, responding very immediately to those developments in Paris, that pamphlet went through 3 editions in 2 months. The second edition sold over 8,000 copies, so this was something that was very, very widely read. And attracted the interests of the press at the time. We then got, suddenly journalists were interested in who is this Karl Marx. They wanted to interview him and speak to him, so it gave him this level of notoriety. It was actually written as the view of the International Working Men's Association on the Paris Commune. And this was an organisation that Marx had helped set up in the 1860s. And it was an attempt to organise labour organisations internationally so that they could cooperate to stop things like strike breaking across national borders and show solidarity across national borders, solidarity of working class people. And Marx organised this organisation with people considerably to the right of his own politics. So this was, quite a sort of broad organisation in some senses. But what he did by writing this pamphlet was he unequivocally allied the International, that's generally what this organisation gets called, he allied the International unequivocally with the cause of the Paris Commune. And in fact, a French member of the International, a man called Henri Louis Toulaine, was expelled for not supporting the Paris Commune. So this was a very, very important statement. And in the Civil War in France, he said, "It is but natural that our association, the International, should stand in the foreground." And often in kind of writing about the Paris Commune today, that's kind of derided by lots of the sort of establishment views of this. Sort of accuse Marx of claiming for himself and for the International an influence that they didn't have in the Paris Commune. Although actually there were a number of very important members of the International who played significant roles in the Paris Commune. At the time, the response was quite different. The press wanted to accuse Marx himself alone of being kind of the sort of evil orchestrator of the Paris Commune, sort of evil genius. And the International Association was targeted. Certainly the French government then persecuted members of the International. And this was all sort of part of accusing them of being part of this sort of plot. That wasn't true, that Karl Marx was the evil mastermind behind the Paris Commune, and he never claimed that was true. Nor did he kind of call for the Paris Commune to happen or to take place. And for this I need to give a little bit of context about what was happening in France and why this working class revolution broke out when it did. In 1870, so the year before the Commune, France and Prussia went to war. It's called the Franco-Prussian War. And in the course of that war, Napoleon III, so-called, who's the nephew of the more famous Napoleon, who'd seized power in a coup d'etat decades earlier, got captured on the battlefield. And there was a subsequent revolution in Paris, and a new government was chosen on the 4th of September 1870. And the beginning of the Civil War in France, Marx paints a picture of the kinds of people that had positions in this new government. They were long-term political careerists. They were deeply corrupt. They'd all been involved in fraud and all of these kinds of things. And they were united by their hatred for the Parisian working class. In the course of the war, Prussia completely overwhelmed France. And the new government, elected on the 4th of September, they know that France is going to have to surrender, but they see in the surrender an opportunity to pacify the Parisian working class, and they think this will be very, very handy for their kind of continued rule. But the thing was that although Paris was under siege by the Prussian army and suffering very, very dreadfully, there was very significant starvation in Paris. No food could get in or out. People were getting news out of Paris by hot air balloons. There was so little food that they killed all the animals in the zoo, and they ate the elephants in the zoo and things like this, and then there was no food left at all. There was no firewood, people were freezing. This is the winter now, people were chopping down the trees in an effort to stay warm. But despite this terrible suffering, workers in Paris were determined to resist, and were determined that they were not going to suffer an occupation, and they certainly weren't going to be sacrificed by the new government. Marx warned in this circumstance. He looked at what was happening in Paris, and he said that any attempt to kind of have a revolution in these circumstances would be a desperate folly. But that's what happened. On the 18th of March, the new government decided that it needed to disarm and disempower Parisian workers, and so troops were sent into Paris under General Lecomte, and they went to go and seize the cannons that the National Guard, this sort of militia in Paris, had actually rescued. They rescued these cannons, stopped them falling into the hands of the Prussians, and they dragged them to the top of Montmartre. So if you know Paris, it's a big hill in the northeast. And so just before dawn, this is all done in a very kind of sneaky way so that no one would know what was happening. Just before dawn, these troops climb up the hill and decide they're going to take the cannons away and disarm the Parisian working class. Perhaps, they thought they could do this because they thought everybody in Paris would be asleep, but that is to forget the times of day that working people actually work and are awake in a city. And what happened was that largely the women of Paris, the women in that area, heard what was going on, understood what was happening politically, and they went out and they confronted the troops, and they argued with them, and they told them, you're not moving these cannons. And actually they persuaded the soldiers who'd been ordered to fire on this crowd of women and children, sort of growing crowd by now, more people are hearing what's going on. The troops actually refused to do that, and instead they turned their guns and shot Lecomte. And that was the problem solved. This is the beginning of the Paris Commune. This is the beginning of the revolution. And in fact, the wealthy just flee after that. They're so terrified by what these women have done that they leave the city. This gives them a chance to kind of reorganize, to regroup, and plan their revenge on Paris. I'm going to talk a bit about what happens in between, but 72 days later, that's exactly what happens. They return and inflict the most appalling suffering on the Parisian working class, who are slaughtered in their thousands. Possibly 20,000 people were killed in 8 days. just immediately after the Paris Commune. And that's when Marx writes this pamphlet. It's in that context. So this wasn't a kind of vanity project of Marx to ally himself with the Commune. I think that's very important to remember, because now, in a way, the Paris Commune, when it's mentioned or we see pictures of it, it kind of fades in a way, in some ways, into sort of memories of other French revolutions that have taken part, and it's we sort of think about the heroic images that we have of the revolution that look like other heroic images of French revolutions. Think of those photographs that were taken of people on the barricades. Interestingly, though, those photographs were taken just before the final defense of Paris. Those are taken just before that slaughter of tens of thousands of people takes place. That's not what the beginning of the revolution looked like. The ruling class is very comfortable with kind of sad, heroic tragedies of revolutionaries if everybody gets slaughtered. But of course, what the beginning of the revolution looked like, it wasn't barricades. It was working class women arguing with soldiers. That's obviously been erased. And the sort of notorious place that the communards held in the popular imagination at the time has really been taken by the Bolsheviks in 1917, by the Russian revolutionaries today. But at the time, the Paris communards, they were not regarded by any of the mainstream press as, heroic, legitimate revolutionaries. These people were regarded as criminals. They were described as murderers, as arsonists. They were regarded as the scum of the earth. And these are the people that Marx allies himself with. And that was a very, very important thing to do. When we think about the generation of revolutionaries that Karl Marx came from in 1848, none of the big figures in that wave of revolutions identified with the communards or defended them. Mazzini, for example, had no time for the Paris Commune. Figures later on who kind of became famous, who became more radical, people like Victor Hugo, saw it as a tragedy on both sides kind of thing. None of them identified with the communards in the way that Karl Marx did. And so it's worth stressing this, because if Marx had wanted, a sort of media career and it had been about him, he could have said, well, the defeat of the communards, it proved that I was right all along right at the beginning. They shouldn't have done it. They were doomed. But the word I never really appears in the Civil War in France. It's not about Marx. It's about what was happening in Paris. So what does the pamphlet say? On the one hand, what the pamphlet does is it challenges the lies that were told about the communards. So it challenges this notion that, they were all criminals and murderers and arsonists and all this kind of thing. Marx talks about what the city was really like. He knew people who were there in the city. So he was getting these reports. And in fact, suddenly Paris became a very safe place to be for those 72 days of the Paris Commune. There weren't thefts, there weren't murders. You could walk the streets very, very safely. And people wanted to live in a different kind of a way. There was a rejection against militarism. So this wasn't some kind of nationalist revolt. Very much the opposite. In fact, one of the kind of important symbolic things that happened during the Paris Commune was when they tore down the Vendôme column. And this is a kind of big column. It's been re-erected. But it was a big column celebrating the military victories of the first Napoleon. So that was torn down as a symbol of kind of national chauvinism. Marx points out in the pamphlet that the Minister of Labour was Leo Frankel, who was a member of the International, and Marx describes him as German. He was born in Hungary, but he'd had a very long experience in organising in Germany. So again, there's this kind of internationalist sentiment. This is, a city that had been at war with Prussia, and yet, there were Germans very much kind of involved in constructing the commune and playing important roles. When factories and workshops were abandoned by the capitalists, they were taken over and run as cooperatives, run in along completely different lines, not for profit. The church was separated from education. So this meant no longer were children going to school and being taught by the clergy. It was a real kind of insistence that education ought to reflect the most enlightened ideas of the age. It also meant that children were treated equally, whether they'd been born to parents who were married or unmarried, so-called illegitimate children. And this really pointed to a kind of transformation of the position of women inside society as well. And there were many women leaders involved in the Commune. The most famous is, of course, Louise Michel, but there were many, many others besides who helped organise the defence of Paris, who were involved in the political arguments, the political clubs, including women like Elizabeth Dmitriev, also a member of the International. So they did play a very important role. So these were some of the kind of things that were happening in Paris under the Commune. And he also defended them against some of the attacks and explained the kind of context of the things they were doing. So one thing that happened when the troops came in to slaughter the Parisian working class was the communards burnt whole sections of Paris. Big important buildings were set on fire, which makes it quite difficult in some ways to do archival research on Paris in the periods just before this, because the records were burnt in the town hall. And at the time, because arson is obviously destroying private property, at the time this was described as the most kind of unimaginable brutality. And Marx talked about the way in which this was a defensive strategy. If you've got troops coming after you and wanting then to occupy the positions that you previously held, you don't want that to happen. But he also spoke about the kind of hypocrisy of those sort of attitudes, this kind of outrage that was being manufactured. And he asked how ruling classes conducted their wars. He calls back to the British Empire fighting the Opium Wars in China. 3 wars fought for the so-called right of Britain to deal illegal, make profit out of selling illegal drugs. And he talked about how the Summer Palace in China was just gutted by fire and then looted, artifacts that still there's questions about where on earth those ended up. He also talked about the way in which the troops coming in were just bombarding and shelling houses, setting fire to them. And he said, okay, so it's okay if you set fire to a house and there's human beings inside it, that's perfectly acceptable. But to set fire to things as a kind of tactic of guerrilla war is apparently beyond the pale. So on the one hand, Marx is doing this, and he's doing it because he knew that what actually had happened in the Commune was inspirational, and that this would provide an inspiration to working class people internationally if they knew the truth about what had happened and what was able to be achieved. And he knew that it was important then to get the truth out against the lies that were being told about the Commune, but also against the attempt to physically wipe out all memory of the Commune, which of course was what was going on with the murder of so many people. But the pamphlet does something else, and this tells us a lot about Marx's method, his kind of framework for analysing things. And it's very different from those kind of revolutionary approaches that I spoke about, the ones that he was opposed to, this idea that the intelligent revolutionary will turn up and tell the ignorant masses what is going to happen to them. It's Marx learning from struggle, learning from working class struggle, and that's what makes the book a very useful book for revolutionaries. Vladimir Lenin was reading the Civil War in France in 1917, so useful was it. And Lenin observed that in this pamphlet, Marx makes the only kind of, Marx makes the only sort of big amendment to what had been written in the Communist Manifesto, which was about the nature of the state. And that is this, that Marx writes that the state can appear to be separate from society, and therefore something neutral. But he argues that, in fact, it's an engine of class despotism. That separation that we feel from the state, I think, is reflective of the lack of control that we have over it. I doubt whether Rishi Sunak feels disconnected from the state and like it's just some kind of neutral body where ideas can be debated out. But we have a kind of different feeling about it. And what the communards realised was this, that therefore it wasn't a question of getting the so-called right people into roles in the state. There had to be a complete kind of revolutionising of those relationships. Marx puts it very beautifully in a way I think it still rings true. He says, instead of deciding once in 3 or 6 years which member of the ruling class was to misrepresent the people in Parliament, universal suffrage was to serve the people. So this is a very different way of running things. What does that mean, universal suffrage was to serve the people? What it meant was this, that everybody who had a position in the commune was not only elected by universal male suffrage, but they were directly recallable. So if they started to do things that people disagreed with, they could be replaced. This included not just representatives, but also magistrates, judges, things like that. They were paid workers' wages, which is something that is certainly not the case. Not the case today. MPs are paid over 84 grand. And so the state that they created was one that was controlled by the working class and answerable to the working class. And the people they elected were totally different from the kind of people that were in government on the 4th of September. It wasn't these people who had long-term political careers, who were very well known, committing fraud and all these kind of things. These were people that no one had ever heard of. In Europe. These are working class people that were respected inside their own communities and seen as leaders. And what Marx wrote about this is, I want to give a bit of a quote here, a bit of a long quote, but it's what he says is really important about the commune, so I think it's very important. He said, its secret was this: it was essentially a working class government, the produce of the struggle of the producing against the appropriating class, so workers against the capitalist class, the political form at last discovered under which to work out the economical emancipation of labour. Except on this last condition, the communal constitution would have been an impossibility and a delusion. The political rule of the producer cannot exist with the perpetuation of his social slavery. And so what Marx is saying here is that all of the kind of inspirational aspects of the commune were only made possible by the revolutionising of society, by getting rid of the very bases on which capitalist society rests. That's the private property belonging to the few and the exploitation and dispossession of the many. And what I want to end on it is the Marxist approach to history, which on the one hand doesn't treat history the way the kind of those that said they had the plan and what Marx called the utopians, which regards history as completely unimportant. On the other hand, it's not the kind of stamp collecting approach to history that is just about knowing loads and loads of dates and loads of events, the way history is often taught, unfortunately. You'll know if you went to the session on the manifesto. In the manifesto, Marx says that the history of all previous societies is the history of class struggle. And what he's doing in this pamphlet is exploring that to understand how change was achieved in the past and what we can learn from that to transform the present. And that's why this pamphlet remains so important and so inspirational today.